Welcome back to Campus Compact's Compact 20 virtual gathering. As I was 15 minutes ago, I remain Andrew Seligson, president of Campus Compact, and it's very nice to be back with you. We are gearing up for our next session. Attention is the Scarcity, a new approach to civic digital literacy, presented by Mike Caulfield, and we'll turn to that in just a few moments. But before we do that, a few reminders. If you are joining us for the first time, so first of all, welcome. And just a couple of notes about how all this operates. The first is that by participating in this event, you agree to abide by our code of conduct. Our staff will now share the link to the code of conduct in the chat on the various platforms. The main point of this is behave civilly and respectfully, and everybody's good. And we will have an excellent conversation. And we certainly encourage you to engage in the chat and connect with each other in that way, just in a way that's compatible with the code of conduct. The second one is if you've got a question for Mike Caulfield, you can post it in the chat, either on Facebook or YouTube Live, wherever you're watching this. We have volunteers from our staff who will be putting questions together into a Q&A for the end of the session, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So we appreciate your posting them, and you can post them at any time during the session. So, go ahead as soon as you hear things that you'd like to ask about. If you have a technical question, you can also post it in the Facebook or YouTube Live chat. And again, one of our staff members will be able to assist with that. So those are the kind of basic stuff for how we operate. And now we can turn to the session. As I said, the session is Attention is the Scarcity, a new approach to civic digital literacy. This session is offered in partnership with the American Democracy Project of ASKU. And as I said, the presenter will be Mike Caulfield. Mike is Director of Blended and Network Learning at Washington State University, Vancouver. He previously served as an instructional designer at Keene State College and Director of Community Outreach for the Open Courseware Consortium at MIT. Mike has a longstanding interest in civic digital life, from his early experimentation with educational wikis to his 5,000-member online community, Blue Hampshire. He currently directs the Digital Polarization Initiative, also known as DigiPo, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, a cross-institutional initiative to improve civic discourse by developing web literacy skills in college undergraduates as part of the American Democracy Project. DigiPo has reached thousands of students through Mike's collaboration with both faculty in a 9-school consortium, and also informally. And I will say, as a follower of Mike's Twitter stream, I've seen lots of people reporting on the ways they're using the work that he's done in their own courses. So I am very appreciative that Mike Caulfield is with us, and I'm going to turn the floor over to him now.
Hey, thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to go through some slides, and then we're going to have a conversation. What I want to focus on is the core thing I want people to take away from this is how small changes in how we teach students to use and think about the web can lead to big impacts in terms of civic engagement, social life, and critical consumption. But I'm going to start out with an assessment that we gave students pre and post in a pilot that we did. It had a bunch of prompts like this. This is the famous Fukushima flowers prompt. And so you give students this and you give a link to it. And it says, Fukushima nuclear flowers. Not much more to say. This is what happens when flowers get nuclear birth defects, right? And you ask, is this good evidence of radiation levels, outside the Fukushima power plant in Japan? And again, the students are given this, and they're allowed to go anywhere on the web, do whatever they want to investigate. They get about 5 minutes to look at it and come up after their investigation, write a few sentences, both on whether they think it is true or whether they think it's false. Now, this is one of 8 prompts that we used. The prompts, we gave students different prompts, four prompts at the beginning, 4 prompts at the end. They were different prompts, but we used a method of assessment that crossed those over. So the students that got the first set of prompts at the beginning, got the second set of prompts at the end, and vice versa. I can talk more about the experimental design if people want to delve into that after the session. I'm going to show you, though, some of not the actual responses on whether they think it's trustworthy, but some of the pre and post sentences students wrote, not just on this prompt, but on 7 other prompts as well. Before and after the instruction that we gave them. And I think you'll see some difference here. So this is the same student, right? So all these are going to be the same student. Now they're responding to different prompts with different truth values, and so you want to kind of keep that in mind. And these are actually the full responses, right? The students are encouraged to do spend time doing the investigation, but then just sum up very simply why they decided whether something was trustworthy or not. I'm not going to show you every single prompt that we did. It would take the whole session just to go through all the prompts. Although again, I can answer any questions if you're curious about what some of these prompts were. I can talk more about that. So here's the student. Here's one of the students before our intervention, right? And their response is just why they think it's not trustworthy that doesn't appear to be factual. Post the student saying it is trustworthy, and this is their response. From Wikipedia, I found the site that reported this newser to be relatively new but seemingly trusted. I also searched the article title and found a Time article of the same name. Okay, same student. Okay, here's another student. Before, they say the reason they don't trust this thing is the website itself has a ton of ads, the headlines are ridiculous. Post, the Washington Post and CNN reported on the same story, which are highly credible news sources. These sources contributing to the story gave me a reason to trust this source, right? Here's another student, and again, matched pre-post. This image was posted on Imager, which I would not consider an extremely reputable source. In addition, minimal information provided with the image. Post, I did a reverse image search of this image and pulled up various vet websites such as petmd.com. While there is a tiny chance this can happen to your dog, it is extremely rare according to the articles I looked at. It's probably a good idea to check the mouth, though. You probably are wondering what that prompt is, and I can talk about that a little later. And then I think this is our final example of a pre-post. Advertisements on the page, lack of evidence for a website at the bottom page. This is their reason for not trusting it, right? Post, by looking at Snopes, I have high trust in this photo being evidence of a condition that can affect dogs because it was posted by a vet tech and there are multiple instances of this happening. The only reason I didn't select very high is because Snopes reached out to the group that posted this image for more information and did not receive any. Now, here I think is the fascinating thing. What separates these pre and posts are 4 hours of instruction, right? Just 4 hours of instruction, 240 minutes of instruction. And we didn't actually teach any critical thinking, any traditional critical thinking in those sessions. And yet, when you look at those prompts, I mean, if I was to show you this and ask, what did you teach? I think you'd say, well, you taught critical thinking, right? No, we didn't. We didn't teach that at all. We taught basic web skills. What do the web skills look like, right? What did we teach them? Okay, we taught them this model. It used to be called 4 Moves. It's now in this helpful acronym called SIFT. The 4 moves are stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context, which are strategies, right? But each of the strategies is tied to specific web techniques. And let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to use some coronavirus examples because it's on everybody's mind. So here's an article, China coronavirus hype straight out of CDC flu playbook. Say you come upon this on the web and you think, well, should I share this? Should I not? Is this worrisome? Is it not? You could start reading it and say, does it make sense? Does the headline seem inflammatory? You could ask a bunch of things. What we find actually is when people ask those sorts of questions, they get fooled pretty easily still, right? What we actually do is this. So here we come up to the top and we just strip everything off that domain name and we add Wikipedia. And we find that there's a Wikipedia page here. And already on David Icke, the guy running the site, already we notice there's some issues here. David Icke is described just even in the blurb in this Google search, is described as a professional conspiracy theorist, right? And look how fast this is, right? This is, it's not even 10 seconds, you know? Now, if we want to go further, right, we could delve into that a little further. And we'll find that if we click through to Wikipedia, we find professional conspiracy theorist, also former footballer, 5 citations on professional conspiracy theorist if we want to track that down. Or if we want, we can scroll down further in the article and find that he also believes that the world is run by a race of secret shape-shifting lizard people. And I'm not actually making it up. That's actually what David Icke believes. He believes that the leaders of the world are actually a race of like alien lizards that have some sort of shape-shifting qualities, right? Yeah. So, you know, again, really quick, right? So this is part of the investigate the source. Now, investigate the source is tied to some questions. And the questions are important. We actually find the students, except for this third question, the students actually already have a native grasp on this, right? So, the questions we ask when we investigate the source are they in a position to know, right? Either through being a witness or expertise or life experience or lived experience. Do they have incentives to be careful with the truth? And this last one, are they likely to present a summary of current thinking or argue a specific case? And that's the only one that we have to really work with the students. The students get these other ideas pretty naturally. If you think about these other ideas, they're kind of what you use in your personal life to understand whether someone's a trustworthy source on personal gossip, for example. They aren't really difficult epistemological ideas. And the techniques that we use are just add Wikipedia, and we use this other one called profile hover, right? This is profile hover. We just hover over the profile. We see what it says. Now, in this case, it's verified, so we know the person is who they say they are. We know they're not an imposter. That doesn't mean that they're trustworthy. And this is from way back when a single coronavirus case was, news. And this person is reporting the first one in Sacramento County. Now, we go and we see what that person's are they in a position to know? And in this case, they're a meteorologist. And that's not so bad, right? They probably have some credibility they have to protect. But ultimately, their reputation is more based on whether they accurately predict the weather than whether they get a story right. So we might want to find a better source than that. It's not perfect, right? The expertise doesn't quite match up. This one here from an Emmy award-winning reporter, right? So more of a match. She works for the local CBS affiliate in Sacramento. Is a story about Sacramento. There's some local expertise here. She's in a position to know. She's got incentives to tell the truth. She has a reputation here to look after, which means that she's more likely to be careful with what she tweets, right? But again, you notice that these are tied to really simple web techniques, and then the sort of strategies and the sort of questions kind of come out of the web techniques. The web techniques almost raise them automatically. Here's a more difficult one. So this is Ian McKay, and he's a virologist, and he's verified here, right? So he really is who he says he is. It's harder to assess, niche expertise, right? So we don't really know, like, is Ian in the mainstream of his field? Is he on the fringe of his field? And so this would probably take a deeper investigation. It also might not be a great first stop, right? We might want to go and get more of a 40,000-foot view of what all virologists say before we delve into what Ian says, so that we can understand whether Ian is proposing something that is, either part of a consensus, part of a dissensus, highly debated, fringe, whatever it is, right? So let's investigate the source, right? And we have these questions. They come out of a really simple technique. Find better coverage. So this is just the idea that the story that usually reaches you, the version of the story, is often the most inflammatory, like overwrought story. It makes its way through the web because it's really clicky, right? So find better coverage just says when you get a story, go see if there's a better one before you waste your time on the one that reached you, right? the story that reached you is not the one you have to read. It's a hard thing for a lot of people to understand, but you're really under no compunction to read the version of the story that reached you. You can go and find a better one. So let me show an example of that. This is called News Search Crosscheck. And so we get something from here, and this is not a great source. Like we do our investigate the source, and we find this is just another one of those crappy COVID-19 news aggregators. But it's saying that money is being disinfected, and this is kind of an old story. Money is being disinfected by China out of COVID-19 fears. When we actually take the terms from that and just plug them into a web search, a news search, we find that multiple other outlets are actually reporting this, right? So just when we do this news search here, we'll find that CNBC is reporting it, right? The Guardian is reporting it. ABC News in Australia, which is an Australian broadcasting network, is reporting. If we click through to the Guardian article, we'll see that it's the AFP. It's syndicated from the AFP in Beijing, right? So it's an international news agency. The AFP is like the French Reuters, right? It's an international news organization that is sourcing this. It's a reliable source, and we can share that. This is one of the principles of info-environmentalism: is that the story reaches you through a source that's not so good. Find a better source, share that better source, and incrementally make the information environment better for everybody, right? Because you haven't sort of needlessly propagated low-value sources. You've essentially traded up, right? All right, here's news source cross-check on another sort of story. So this is something saying that China, it's basically this idea that Chinese doctors are wandering around with guns and executing the sick. And I want to be clear, China is an authoritarian state, and I think we should take allegations of authoritarian behavior very seriously. But are doctors wandering around shooting sick patients? And so we can do a news search cross-check here. And again, when we first search for this, we pick some search terms and nothing comes up, which is kind of weird. If China's actually doing this, you would think, well, you'd see some news stories here, but nothing comes up. So we tweak that a little bit. And we see there's a Snopes article here. And the Snopes article goes and it says it's miscaptioned. It turns out these are not doctors wandering around with guns shooting people. This is actually police in Wuhan had put on PPE, right? So they kind of look like doctors, but they're just police officers wandering around with their normal equipment. Sometimes people say, well, a lot of things, not everything's true or false, and that's true, right? So, for example, if you looked, and I'm not expecting you to read this slide, by the way, but if you looked at, does hand washing work against coronavirus in January, you'd find that it was unequivocally believed and supported. Hand washing works against the spread of virus. Nobody doubts that. But if you looked at masks, what you find is there was a lot of debate, right? And so a lot of people say, well, first they thought masks didn't work, and then they thought masks did work. Well, one of the things you find when you do this search is you find if you were actually doing these searches when you were in January, you wouldn't believe that they originally thought masks wouldn't work and now they thought masks work. You'd think, actually, there's a lot of debate, even in January. Do masks work or do they not? And so you have a better sense of some of the nuance of some of these debates when you go out. The final one is a little different. It's trace claims, quotes immediate to the original context. So a lot of times we're seeing stuff like this, right? So this says that Harvard professor Charles Lieber, who is the head coronavirus expert, was charged with working with the Chinese government and working with the Wuhan lab, and he's been arrested, and this is all part of a narrative that it's really like COVID-19 is really the result of a bioweapon and a whole bunch of conspiratorial stuff I don't want to get into. But you look down here, it is cited by CNN. The citation is by CNN. And this people do this a lot. So this is called click through and find. We click through it, and we hit Control F, right? And we see, does coronavirus or COVID-19 exist in this article? And so here we go. Let's search, and we find no. I mean, it doesn't. The only thing we're finding here are headlines from other stories, right? Coronavirus, COVID-19, none of this exists in the article. So this is called context hacking. And in this case, there is a Harvard professor who has been arrested, but his research has nothing to do with COVID-19 or coronavirus or any of this stuff. This is all, that's just all hooey. So I've gone through, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. So that's the IFT, right? The S in SIFT is stop. And so it's just, if you're feeling a strong emotion or an urge to share, stop and ask yourself, what am I looking at, right? Do I know what I'm looking at? Do I know where it came from? If you don't know basic things about the provenance of what you're looking at, you're not in any position to read it. Like, I don't even want you to read it until you know where it's from, right? I certainly don't want you to share it until you know where it's from. If it's a complex claim and you're looking at sort of a niche analysis, it's not clear that you should be looking at the niche analysis before you read a broad overview of what the thinking is on a subject, right? You don't want to dive into a niche analysis without understanding the broad scope of a debate, right? That's not a good approach, right? So part of what stop is just stop. Do not engage, right? And what we find is a lot of the techniques that we have given students in the past really encourage them to immediately engage with whatever's in front of them. Because this is kind of what we've trained students to do, right? We put a piece of paper in front of them or an article, and we say, read it deeply, react, follow the logical arguments. This is really bad advice on the web, because if you start reading things deeply and reacting to them without knowing what you're looking at, you're gonna become a really confused individual, and perhaps do a disservice to your community in what you share, spread, and promote. So again, stop. So stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. And so now I think some of these make a little more sense. And again, this is after 4 hours of instruction. And I look at these and I just see entirely different students. And what I start to realize when we do this is we tend to think that students have a critical thinking problem, that they don't have nuance because of something going wrong with the processes of their thought. But when we do this and we see the difference in students, we realize in some ways we have that backwards. They don't have the nuance because they haven't grounded themselves in the context. They don't have the context because we haven't shown them how to get the context, right? We've taught them to react, but we haven't shown them how to zoom out. We haven't shown them these techniques that fact checkers use on the web, that web literate people use on the web. And once you fix that problem, right? Once you fix that problem, once you make sure that the student is grounding themselves in the context, in the provenance of the stuff that comes to them, in answering these basic questions about the artifact in front of them, it turns out that they're much more equipped to deal with such things, right? So again, it's fascinating to me. I think we've mislabeled the problem as critical thinking. That's not critical thinking at all. It's really about, I mean, in some ways it is. It's about a sort of epistemological grounding, but it's not as hard a problem to solve as people think. One final thing, a lot of people say, well, does it stick, right? Does it stick? You can show that the students do this at the end of the course, but does it really stick? And it's really hard to get an experimental answer to that without, like, I don't know, like you'd have to surveil students, like install some malware on their computer and see what they're doing in 6 months. And we don't want to do that, right? But we did have an unintended testimony to this when we ran our pilot. At CUNY Staten Island, they put our instruction, and they did it really strictly at CUNY. They did exactly what we had prescribed. They put it in all their freshman intro courses, the freshman like their freshman experience course, right? And they weren't communicating with the scholarship office, and why that's important, I'll reveal in a minute. So only a select number of people in that first year experience program knew that they had put this week and a half, 2 weeks of training into that course. The head of that program got a letter from the head of the scholarships and grants office the following semester, right, in May. So they did this in fall. Following semester in May, they got or it might have actually been June at that point, but it was about stuff that had happened in April and May. They got an email from the head of that program. And what that person said was that they run this program, and every year it's a big granted program, and every year they take incoming sophomores, right? So they interview freshmen. They go through this whole interview process in that office with them, because when they get to if they get to the finals for that scholarship, they're going to have to answer all these questions. And so, they take 20 students or something like that, and they ask the applicants a bunch of questions. So I'll just read it through here. One of the questions our committee asks applicants is, where do you get your news? The fellowship seeks students who are knowledgeable about domestic and global issues, as well as students who are motivated to effect positive social change. This question is often asked of nominees who go forward into the official competition. Therefore, we make it a point to ask this question for our internal campus competition. In years past, we received such answers as social media, or perhaps one or two news stations. Occasionally, a student would cite the New York Times as a primary source for news. This year, we were astounded at the answers we received to this question. Nearly every applicant told us how they compare different news stations for different perspectives, and how they seek to verify the news they are reading. Most applicants further cited international sources of news for an even wider perspective. We couldn't believe the change this year, how intelligent and worldly and diligent they all sounded, more so than many older adults. One of the applicants told us that she learned to do this in Core 100. Whatever you're doing, it's working. I'm very impressed and quite moved. And that's the difference that we can that's the difference that we can have here, and that's the difference I hope that we will. That's the difference that I hope we all work together to achieve. So I'm ready for any questions, conversations, complaints.
Excellent. Well, Mike, first of all, thank you for sharing that really clear presentation of the thing you're teaching and the way that it works for students. And we had a number of questions that we will get into. I wanted to start with a kind of conceptual clarification. I want to be totally clear. I don't think there's an enormous amount at stake in the language we use, but I just think it could be helpful for people.
Yeah.
One of the first things you said is what we don't teach is critical thinking.
Yeah.
And it certainly sounds like, in ordinary language, some of the things you're teaching, like, hey, evaluate whether this person seems like they are likely to know about the thing, might involve critical. So can you just tell us, like, what is it you're distinguishing what you're doing from, and why is that important? Yeah.
So I probably should stop bashing critical thinking, because it gets me nowhere. But the problem with critical thinking is actually just it's sort of, it doesn't actually mean anything. Critical thinking can mean anything. And so you end up with this really mushy concept where some people talk about critical thinking. And what do they mean? They mean following the logical train of arguments inside an essay. Some people mean thinking about bias, and things like that. So critical thinking, and I mean, there are literally, I could name 12, 15 other things people covered by critical thinking. Critical thinking ends up being, in a lot of senses, just whatever, happens to suit your needs. You'll find actually that conspiracy theorists love the idea of critical thinking, because they're of course critical thinking because they're not accepting a given narrative. They're going against a given narrative. That's critical thinking, and so it's not a term that actually means a whole bunch. But the distinction I'm making is that it's not actually the thinking part that's the problem. It's the doing part, right? It's the actual exploration that the students are missing, right? Now, what they do afterwards, maybe once they have the facts, right, they sit down there, and maybe we can call that critical thinking, that they think, well, do I really want to be getting my information on the benefits of milk from the dairy industry? And maybe that's critical thinking, right? But the distinction I'm making is the students already know that. The students already intuitively, we don't have to teach the students, don't get your information on the benefits of milk from the dairy industry. Like, that's not something we have to teach. The thing the students are missing is they don't actually build the habits and take the steps to find out that the message that they are looking at is from the dairy industry. So that involves a doing, right? It involves not sitting and sort of piecing things together. It involves a sort of doing. And so that's the distinction I'm making. Is actually less about the thinking the students are doing, and it's more about getting the students to build habits. So by the time that they are thinking, they have the relevant facts in front of them.
So one of the questions we had come in from Kelsey Maglio, who's joined us on YouTube, is, I think, a good follow-up to that, which is, once we get beyond, in other words, we don't want to teach students simply that an appeal to authority is the way to settle questions. So how do you balance wanting them to evaluate the sources with needing them also to be competent at then evaluating content and making judgments about that? How do those fit together?
Well, so I'm going to have a slightly disconcerting answer here. And, so when you think, so epistemologists call anything that we can't verify directly testimony, right? So, so if you look at, there's some things I can verify directly, right? Someone says, Mike's cell phone is on the table, right? I can verify that directly, right? There's a range of things, and actually, if you go back, 400 years, most things you cared about, a lot of things you cared about, you could probably verify directly, right? And so that's sort of a pre-modern epistemology, right? Most things nowadays you can't, and as a matter of fact, you don't actually have the expertise to sort through the information yourself. And this is really disconcerting to people, because people feel like, well, there's no bottom. Isn't it all just appeals to authority? And in a way it is, right? In a way it is. We're looking right now, for example, at least, so there are some political actors during the COVID-19 pandemic that really believe, well, they got to sort through the information themselves and come to their own conclusions, sort through all the details, sort through all the research themselves, and come to their own conclusions about, what the mortality rate is on COVID-19 and what one should do. And that's really not a good strategy. You're not smart enough to do that. You really aren't, right? So what's the alternative? I think the idea is an appeal to authority is seen as a fallacy, because we just say, well, this person has authority, right? This person has authority, as if the authority is just kind of like bestowed, What students actually need to understand is the mechanisms of authority in a bit more of a nuanced way, right? So one of the things when we do the check, find better coverage, is we're really promoting to students that it's not enough to say, well, this is a famous virologist, right? And they say this, and therefore this is correct, right? What we actually want to look is the systems that are in place. We want to think about the systems that are in place that bring about, again, consensus on issues and dissensus on issues, and understand how that works. And ultimately, know that, for example, even though the American Medical Association might occasionally be wrong on certain things, that statistically we're going to be a lot better off choosing something like the American Medical Association or the CDC than sorting through all this raw information ourselves and trying to make sense of it. And I've just seen, like, I know this is, it's a really hard pill to swallow because it feels disempowering at first. But we've seen how this goes on the internet. We've seen this. We've run this experiment already. And if you want to look at what's going to happen, it's the people that want to, decide for themselves, who don't actually have the understanding of science, not as a set of experiments where people individually verify things, but science as a community that comes to consensus on some issues and stays in disagreement on others, has certain mechanisms, for, coming to that consensus. It's really the people that don't want to tap into those social structures that allow us to solve problems, but instead verify things individually, that are going to be the cause of a lot of death and a lot of suffering. I don't know. It's like I said, it's a hard thing for people to swallow, but we're going to have to come to get over our individualistic, narcissistic epistemology and move on to something that is a collective. That's a better understanding of what our collective and collaborative epistemology looks like, and start tapping into that. Or otherwise, we're going to fry the planet to a crisp, and we're going to end up killing everybody in these things like these pandemics, because we're unable to actually tap into the social structures that provide us the knowledge that might actually help.
Well, at least you've reassured us that the stakes are low, so that's comforting.
Yeah, it's good.
So we are getting actually lots and lots of great questions, which is terrific. So we'll see what we can get through. There's a set of questions that have to do with teaching. And let me start with one that I know you've been working on, which is just how do you help faculty build the teaching of this set of skills into their courses? What's that look like, and how can people get involved in that?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways. We in the pilot, we had faculty teach it directly, and I think I think that was good, and we worked with faculty to do that. We found in a lot of cases that faculty were stressed about teaching this, that they didn't feel that they themselves had the level of skill that really gave them the confidence to present this stuff, a lot of times live in front of students. And so we've been thinking about that piece and wondering, faculty actually love teaching the domain specific stuff around this. And then the skills, they just feel like they don't have them at a level of fluidity. So we've been thinking about separating those two parts. And I've been talking with some folks down at ASU's News Collab. And one of the things that we've come to is there's really two pieces to this. And one is the skills piece, right? In showing people how to understand, basically get the layout of a particular issue, understand where a person's authority comes from or doesn't come from. And then there are sort of these structures, the information structures in a domain, which actually professors are very knowledgeable about. And yet they don't teach these, right? So if you think about it, you've gone through all these biology classes and they've taught you how to independently verify Gregor Mendel's findings, but your biology class doesn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about how the CDC comes to a recommendation, who is consulted, right? Doesn't really deal with the, what you can and can't trust in a high-profile journal, or even in many cases doesn't even really talk about the difference between a literature review and promoting a single finding. Certainly doesn't talk about the network of policy think tanks, what they're good for, what they aren't good for, and get people familiar with all these information structures that are crucial to understanding in evaluating ideas, right, in our economy, right? So if people really think the CDC, in a recommendation from the CDC, is just what one individual at the top of the CDC says, well, they're going to be more suspicious of that, right? So we're not teaching them these structures. The same thing in terms of the press, like, how does a newspaper work, right? And we need to do that as well. So I think there are these two pieces, and what I've come to recently is I think we need to develop some online instruction that gets students these skills. I think faculty will learn them. They just don't want to present them at the front of the classroom at the risk of making a mistake, right? So we do that online, and then I think we have this other piece that we want to involve faculty in that talks about, how does your discipline actually come to conclusions? How does it move forward? How does it resolve disagreement? How do you think about what it means to be published in this journal and what it doesn't mean to be published in this journal? And we need to involve faculty in that half of it, where I think they have a lot of comfort, and they just have never been asked to teach that. They're too busy teaching students to replicate experiments, as if students are going to find out whether global warming is true or false by throwing some stuff into test tubes and taking some notes.
Let's see. No. I'm just thinking about where to go next, because there's so many questions that are points of like tangency from things you just discussed. So maybe one that I'll jump to comes from Laura Bennett on Facebook. You just discussed in some ways the lack of confidence of faculty members and how that can be a factor. On the flip side, I think what Laura's pointing to is sometimes the overconfidence that younger people have, including many students, in their sort of facility with media. And so she talks about having actually used the Fukushima flowers example, and a student kind of saying that she knew all about these kinds of flowers and that what they did without actually assessing where the information was coming from, et cetera. And is that a barrier you have to break through at the beginning? What's that been like in the experience you've had?
Yeah, so there's two questions there, right? The first is we need the constantly refreshed prompts, right? So Fukushima flowers is an interesting one, because now Sam Weinberg's work with Sheg, a lot of people are doing that at the high school level, right? And they already know the prompt, right? So you've got to refresh these prompts. But the other piece is, how do we get students to stop saying, "Oh, I already know how to do this," when they clearly don't, right? When all the research shows they don't. And the answer is you structure the instruction in such a way that you have the students make some sorts of predictions about what is true and what is false, and then you show how they're wrong, right? And you do that in ways that you got to kind of hit that in a way that really clearly demonstrates that their current methods are inadequate, while at the same time not being sort of crushingly abrasive that they're wrong. But you've got to structure that. We call that in instruction design, we call that expectation failure, right? That the students have an expectation that this will go this way, and then when it fails, now they're willing to receive, oh, okay, now they're willing to think about how do I get better at that. And so one of the things we do is we do some activities early on in the class where the students try to evaluate various things, and we find that they make gargantuan mistakes, and then we soften it by really showing that all the students are doing that, right? So we try to balance that by not showing this, but the students make the mistake, but they're able to laugh at it because all the students are making the same mistake, and then we sort of proceed from there. But yeah, I would say that it's initially a little bit of a challenge, but I will say that the students, you can even take the students that are a little resistant and say they know how to do this, say, well, we're going to show you how to do it faster. And we've really honed our stuff so that it's not only this sort of investigation, but it's as quick as it can be, and the students will get enough into that. So there are ways around it. It definitely does take that sort of instructional design dance.
Just to add a little personal testimony about expectation failure. One of the moments when I became a true believer in your work, Mike, was I think you posted on Twitter this story that I had seen about. It was when the Colin Kaepernick did the Nike ad, and then there was allegedly this
Oh yeah,
story
yeah,
of
the
people
burnt
burning
Nikes
their
in the burning
shoes.
house. Yeah,
And
yeah.
there was a story in USA Today about this guy who allegedly had accidentally burned his house down when he burned his Nikes. And the thing that was circulating on the internet looked like a photograph of a clip from the physical USA Today. And I
Yeah.
had seen that. And I didn't think much about it, but I just kind of thought there was a real story like that in USA Today. And then I think it was in a Twitter thread or something, showed that, in fact, if you go to the physical newspaper for that date, there was no such story and somebody had just photoshopped it. And of course, I know such a thing is possible, and it hadn't even occurred to me. And it made me realize, as you say, the limits of critical thinking, because what I did was sort of thought, could there be a moron who would light their shoes on fire and burn their house down? Sure. And I figured it was probably right, and it was just completely invented and reinforced a stereotype that I must have been carrying around without thinking about it a lot. That for me was an opening up experience in just the way you're describing when you realize.
Well, and it's an interesting one too, because the title of this is "Attention is a Scarcity," and I didn't really talk so much about that issue, but to kind of bring it back around to that issue. You got to have a method that allows people, when they see that, to check it in 20, 30 seconds, which I think my demo showed how you could, in 30 seconds, you could find out that wasn't true. Because otherwise you're exposed to so much of this stuff during a day. And if you don't check it, if when you have a reaction to something like that, you don't check it, you're just going to go on and think that it must have been true. So much of what we pick up now in the news is just sort of, it just kind of comes in almost sort of in our peripheral vision, And so what you pay attention to is really important. And if you can spend 20 seconds or 30 seconds in discard the stuff that is not worth your time, not worth your energy, not worth your anger, not worth your attention, then you have time, right, to dig into the things that really are true, that really are horrifying, that really do deserve your attention. And one of the things that we're finding, if you think about activism, right, of any sort, and in student engagement, one of the big traps that we're seeing now, if you look at disinformation campaigns from state actors, from domestic bad actors, from political movements, one of the main aims of them is to corrupt activism, to corrode activism. And the idea is to there are certain things that really matter, that activists need to focus their time and effort and energy on in terms of making the world a better place. On the other hand, if you just start to flood that activist space with nonsense, if you start to put in front of them that Seth Rich was murdered, or even just junk, that look at all these idiots burning their Nike shoes, over time, what you're doing is you're stealing the attention. You're stealing the attention of people, and you're diverting attention from the things that they should be focusing on to things that are either trivial or dangerously wrong. And and that's that's the end of a lot of things we care about, right? And so the reason we call it SIFT is the idea is, when you pay attention to something, yes, I want you something is worth your attention, I want you to read it deeply. I want you to research it deeply. I want you to dig in. I want you to look at the data yourself, when that thing is worth your attention. But you can only get to that place if you have a mechanism for very quickly discarding those things which are not worth your attention. And unless we do that, I think we're all going to a very, very dark place.
So we have some questions that might help us move out into the light.
Okay.
And one comes very similar from Megan Braybeck and from Lynn Pelko, both interested in knowing, do you know of any examples of folks using the technique in a kind of service learning framework where students are learning these techniques and then are going out working with communities of adults older than themselves and helping to teach these to generations that may have less confidence in their own digital capacities, et cetera?
We haven't done anything with that yet. The closest thing that, we haven't done anything with that yet. There is a person I'm working with at University of Washington named Chris Coward, who's very interested in bringing these things into public libraries and making public libraries sort of these centers for older adults that are doing that. But there are two things that are related. The first is we did have a class, still have a class at University of Western Kentucky with Molly Kirby, and her class does some of these deliberative dialogues, right? This deliberative dialogue method where you bring community together to discuss issues, and they get this portfolio of facts, and they actually use the methods to vet the sources in that portfolio that the deliberative dialogue is based on, right? So that's kind of a tangential piece to it. In a more informal way, though, what we see is when we teach kids, and I shouldn't say kids, when we teach students, these skills, they go home and they do teach their parents. They're actually intensely interested in this aspect that they're going to go home and they're going to teach show their mom not to fall for these things, show their father not, or their uncle or whatever, not to fall for these things. So I think in an informal sense, a lot of that knowledge is reaching the adult population through those methods. I mean, I think of it in some ways like, environmentalism when we were, kids, it was really the kids coming home that, sort of taught your parents to recycle, and I see a sort of a similar thing there, that students are really, really concerned about the state of the information environment in our country. And if you teach them these skills, I think they go out and a certain set of them do evangelize them to older adults. We just have to find a way to take that sort of informal process and turn it into something that's more formal, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in practical terms, we're going to turn a little bit later to Slack networking, and if people want to connect with each other and talk about how that might work, I think that's a great opportunity. We obviously have in our audience today people who are quite brilliant at designing experiences, service learning experiences, to take that kind of impulse that you're describing and convert it into practical work. And if Campus Compact can play any role in that, we'd love to. So in that context, Mike, how is this available to people? Are you making this open source? Or are you, how can people get the stuff to do this work?
So there's a couple places you can get it. So years ago, I wrote a book called Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers, but that was literally written in late 2016, early 2017. And so it's a bit out of date now, I think. I mean, the methods we're using now are sort of the same methods, but we've really honed things. There's two current sources that I think are quite good. One is if you look for the Check Please materials and just type in Check Please and Caulfield, and they should come up. It's a course. It doesn't have self-study activities. But it's a course that students can walk through, that teachers can copy and clone if they want to teach these skills. I think it ends up being about 3 hours of instruction. And so the Check Please materials, they're on a site called Notion, which actually allows you to make a copy and edit it to your own standards. And that was done about a year ago. And that might need a refresh as well, but its methods are up to date, right? The more recent stuff, I think the clearest and most concise presentation we have is on a site called infodemic.blog. And so if you go to infodemic.blog, it is, all the examples are tied to the pandemic, the current pandemic. But the language that we use there, the explanations, the examples, probably the most concise that we've gotten this. And that was produced along with some folks at the National Writing Project. So that is a place where it's being used in a bunch of high schools and so forth. But if you go to infodemic.blog, I think that's probably the clearest and most concise. And then I think we'd like to do another go at it that maybe has some self-graded activities or something in it, and we just haven't found the resources to do that yet. But that's where we want to go.
So a question I think we'll wrap up the questioning on, and I'm sure you could, this could be a really long answer. We have just a couple minutes. So I preface it that way. We had a number of questions that are essentially about, in a world where increasingly every source is identified by someone as a partisan source, right? So sources that I think of as credible and pretty neutral, somebody else says they're some kind of wing hackery, whatever. How do you point students to, hey, this is a source that is credible, when from some direction, whether it's Wikipedia or CNN or everything else, somebody's identifying it as partisan?
So here's what we found is that for the most part, students have not politicized most of these sources in their mind yet. They might catch a little bit about CNN or something, right? But people say, well, they're going to say that Snopes is politicized, and first of all, most students don't know Snopes. Right? So students don't even know Snopes, right? We've got this kind of, there's a way in which we kind of, I'm Generation X or so, Generation X, but there's a way in sort of which we project boomer pathologies onto students. Students can be engaged on a number of relatively narrow issues, and I'm sure the people watching this understand this, on issues particularly around gun control. We've seen some of that. But for most things in their lives are not politicized. And as a matter of fact, and as far as the news sources, students often don't know what Newsweek is. Students often don't know, what ABC News is, So they can't have politicized something they've never heard of before, right? So part of the reason why it's so important to get these skills, I think, in college is to get the students to think about sources and what are valuable aspects of sources, and why we value something like network news journalism or newspaper reporting, why we value these different things before someone starts to someone tries to politicize those for them. I'm not saying there aren't political issues and sources. Obviously, there's political issues and sources, but you have to understand what we value in a source and why some of these sources are really important in terms of our information environment. And we can get to the students before that becomes politicized. I'll also just say I do think that there is a bit of a movement here, a potential for a movement among students who are really tired of seeing their parents duped by all this and spreading nonsense and in going on rants about it. They're embarrassed by it. At least that's my experience when students talk in the classroom. They're really embarrassed by this behavior, and often by their family members, and they want to help. So again, it could be a longer answer, because what do we value about these sources? But I would just say, I've seen nothing to indicate that students bring a heavy partisan lens to these traditional sources, at least when we're talking about traditional aged students, in that 18 to 25 slot. Which means there's a huge opportunity here. It means that we can do this and get them to understand how to evaluate sources before other people, I think, try to manipulate that understanding.
Well, Mike, first of all, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done, the research. Thank ADP for the support for that research and for the partnership in this session, and for your taking the time out to share this with us. So this is the funny thing about the online, normally now we would clap for you. So I'm doing that here. People can be doing that where they are. I just have a couple things before we sign off. One is I'm going to answer a question that came in that has nothing to do with Mike's work. I was asked about the thing that's over my right shoulder. I don't know what it looks like on there, work of art on our wall that people can read. I guess that it says good enough, and then it says something under it. It's a piece by an artist from Trenton, New Jersey named Andrew Wilkinson. You can Google him and find him. I used to live in Trenton, and there's a thriving local arts scene there that's fantastic. And it's a piece that says, good enough for who it's for. I assure you it does not reflect our views about this conference. It's always on our wall. But it is a moment to say, go support local artists wherever you are, because they're having a very tough time given the economic context, musicians, visual artists, whatever. So I'll just throw that in. We are at time for this session. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will be back for one of our virtual networking sessions. The Slack networking starts at 2:15, and then we're back with a session in this format again at 3 p.m. So Mike, thank you again so much for sharing with us. Thanks everybody for participating in the session. And I hope you guys do a lot of connecting and learning and sharing in the next hour.
Thanks.